This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 288, All the Ways. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're going to talk all about the ways that Drupal can be used. I'm Nick Laughlin with Enlightened Development, and today joining me for the third consecutive week is Shane Thomas. What's new with you this week?
Not too much, Nick. One mention is, a small little plug. Gatsby's hiring. We've been hiring for a while. So if you see a career that jumps out to you, please apply. We're looking for some good people. And I did buy a new acoustic guitar amp. I play acoustic guitar. I never realized that, acoustic guitar amp can make you sound, I think a little bit better than just hearing it through the acoustic guitar. So that's been a cool, fun little experience. And it's kind of like a middle, like it's really good. So it has a lot of clarity, but not too much where you can hear all my little mistakes. So it's like the right amount.
We should note there that experiences may vary. If you are really bad at playing the electric guitar, the amp is not going to make you any better. Right? Is that accurate?
Right. Yeah. I'm at the level where I didn't want the too expensive one to accentuate the mistakes. So it's kind of like pretty clear. It's like it's a Fender acoustic 100 acoustic amp, but
is it there? Is it that one in the background of the video right there? Yeah, right there. Got it.
Yep.
Wow.
Very cool.
Is that a tube amp?
Nope. Since it's an acoustic, it's not it's more like a PA speaker with just some minor effects.
Okay.
But it's, used it at a, small little coffee shop with a few people the other day, and it was nice.
Shane,
cool.
So on some previous episodes, we've had guests that are into music, and we've included their music at the end of one of our episodes.
Oh, we're not going to do that.
Come on now.
We're not doing that, but I'm working on some stuff. And
okay.
Yeah, if you ever release something, I think we'd be
we can append it in there.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind.
All right.
Doesn't have to be this weekend, next week. Also joining us, as usual, from Parallax Infotech is Stephen Cross. What's new with you this week?
Hey, not so much new. I guess everyone knows the George Floyd trial is happening this week.
Yep.
Maybe you don't know what's going on, but it's always cool to see that you can get this stuff like real time. So court.tv, you can stream the trial if you're interested. You know that I've always been an advocate of C-SPAN, which is where I try to get most of my political news, unfiltered by any political party. So I found today that C-SPAN is also streaming the trial as well. So if you're interested, to me, when I work in my office all day, I listen to talk radio, listen to sports radio, and I do a lot of audio stuff. And the last few days I've been streaming the audio of this trial. So something you could kind of tune into. Check it out.
It's interesting. I'm laughing because I tuned into C-SPAN a couple of weeks ago when the governor of Rhode Island was being confirmed as the commerce secretary. Wanted to see that happen, and my God, it was the most boring process I've ever watched in real time. I was like, okay, I'm like, so
boring,
basically
but it's fascinating.
I'm like, basically they open up the vote and people just randomly walk in and go, thumbs up, thumbs down, and they go, oh, okay, vote. That's your vote. Got it. Just like,
there's some weird things about how government works that you would never know.
I'm like, cool.
It's great. It's great
paint drying.
It's great insight into the political process C-SPAN is, and Court TV is also great insight into the trial process in this country. That you don't get the like the 15-second snippets on the news. You get to see what the whole process is about. Court TV also has, if you go to that channel, they also have like a retrospective of the O.J. Simpson trial. And it's called, I think, OJ 25. I think they produced it last year, and it kind of walks you through the trial over 25 weeks in like an hour episode. So you can recap what that trial was about. Is kind of interesting stuff.
I would have thought they would have called it If the Glove Doesn't Fit.
True.
I'm sure there's like 10 documentaries that already have that name, which is probably why. I'm also, well, I think this is going to be the most awkward self-introduction ever. Joining you this week is also myself. So this week,
you already introduced yourself, Nick.
Yeah, I know. That's why I like stopped halfway through, but by that point it was already too late.
I think we're going to need to work on that.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, yeah, maybe. I just wanted to mention something that I learned this past week. So one of my clients uses AWS significantly. They use a lot of different services for a lot of different purposes. And they kind of have a mishmash of, some things are just spun up, manually. They have CloudFormation templates, which is a way to automate things. I have recently learned about Aws Cdk, which stands for Something Development Kit. I think
probably cloud development kit.
Probably. I can look that up. But it is probably one of the most powerful things I've ever seen from Amazon. You can use whatever language, like Python or TypeScript. So I'm using TypeScript. You can basically spin up services in code. So you basically say like, I need a new Dynamo table, and it's going to be called, Talking Drupal table. And then you can perform actions on that object that you need to. So if you have a Lambda that you're creating, you need to grant write access to that table. You don't have to know anything about roles or permissions or policies. Like you basically just say, grant write access to this function for this table in code. And you can create all those dependencies based on structures that you're building, and then you just deploy it and it spins everything up and deploys it. And the really cool thing is it's got, I don't know how it does it yet, but it has like intelligent checking. So if you have, say, for example, 10 Lambdas functions that are you're developing, and you only change one of them and you deploy, it only deploys that one change. It doesn't deploy all 10 of them. So if you're working on something, it's very easy to deploy. And it also makes it very easy because you can pass in properties. So you could say like, this is a dev or this is a staging environment. So everything, you just prefix or postfix everything with that stage. And so when you're saying like this Lambda has access to this table, well, the Lambda is named whatever is named -dev, the table is named whatever is named -dev. So they're automatically granting each other permission. You don't have to worry about like cross permissioning or anything. It is so slick, super easy to learn, really powerful.
So it's interesting you bring that up, because yesterday I took part in it's called Awesome Day, AWS some day, and it's basically a intro course to all AWS services and kind of like an overview of how they kind of work together. And there's some real nutty AWS services out there that like you can tie them all together and just have like a really, really complex infrastructure like at your fingertips. And it's I put a link to the show notes because the slides are actually super helpful in kind of understanding the AWS ecosystem, and Lambda functions were part of that, and being able to kind of like run code at the time of need versus like just having it sit on a server and spending all less money for that was pretty interesting.
I mean, and the thing is, those aren't even the more obscure services. I mean, they have a satellite uplink service.
They talk about that. Yeah.
Like this amount of stuff that you can get like a trailer dropped off at your house to transfer 200 petabytes of data over 6 months. Like it's mind blowing.
They go into like the first part is like, hey, here are all our services. And the second part is like, hey, here's how you can use them and different things you can do. And it was super interesting.
It sounds like an Ansible or Chef kind of thing for.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a wrapper for CloudFormation templates. So if anybody's ever used CloudFormation templates, they're very verbose. They're really dense. They're hard to parse sometimes. So it's a wrapper for that. Like all it's doing is generating CloudFormation templates, but it solves a real problem. I mean, there's hundreds of AWS services.
Sure.
And I'm sure I'll run into some issues. I'm only a week in, but
Yeah.
I'm ready to move everything to it.
Yeah.
It allows you to very easily make use of some of the more obscure stuff, like ways to create subdependencies and things. And so
Nick, would you say it's equivalent to a Lando wrapper on Docker kind of thing?
On some level. I mean, Lando provides a similar service in that it ties together different containers and abstracts away like the networking and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
This does something similar. It's far more, I mean, AWS is far more complex than Docker.
Yeah, sure.
So CDK is far more complex than Lando. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, and the other thing, because of TypeScript, it has like type ahead and auto completion and stuff. So if you're working on a service that you've never worked with before, you can kind of just like do that thing where you like just type a letter and it shows you all the methods that are available, and you can go, that looks like something I would need. And you can kind of check it out. So it's really powerful. Very happy with it. So also joining us, you've heard him chime in a couple of times, from Oomph Inc., the design firm.
What?
John Picozzi.
That's not what we do.
What did you call it then? You said this morning.
It's a digital services firm.
Digital services firm. Different than a digital agency.
Not agency.
Yeah, different than an agency. What's new with you this week, John?
So some sad news out of the Drupal community this week. Last week on the show, I had mentioned a GoFundMe for Ben from Lullabot, one of the leads over at Tugboat. And, he's fighting, or was fighting, I guess I should say, COVID. And unfortunately, this past week, Ben lost that fight. And, it's sad. Ben had a family, wife, kids, bunch of friends. And, I think, the takeaway here is that, there's a ton of community support happening right now. So, I think you can look on Twitter, you can look, on your social network of choice and see people kind of, reaching out to members of the Lullabot team and, Ben's family, and just, offering support and offering fond memories. And, I think my thoughts this past week have been with Ben's family and, and everybody at Lullabot, because that's tough. It's rough to lose somebody. What's also super inspiring is how much the Drupal community has stepped up to help Ben's family. They started a GoFundMe when Ben was in the hospital to cover hospital costs, and the Drupal community has stepped up. People that know Ben, have worked with him, or people like me that I don't think I've ever met Ben, but still felt compelled to help out. And I think that's it's a great testament to the greater community. And it's super unfortunate. And I think it's inspiring, and it's unfortunate that Ben lost that battle, but I've been thinking about him quite a bit this week. So
you can't, and we've mentioned this a few times in the past few months, is that a lot of times COVID does not impact you directly, and you feel like you can loosen up and you can go against mandates and whatever else, but there are these instances where it really is impacting people. And until it impacts you directly, I don't think you understand the enormity of what this virus or pandemic has really done.
Yeah. I mean, I think everybody out there knows somebody that has been directly affected by this. And it's unfortunate, especially when you see somebody that, vibrant community member, father, husband, lose that battle. It's tough. So if you are able, to help out Ben's family, do so, or even just, send a message of support. I think that's important too. It's important, for his family to see, how loved he was, and yeah, I think it's important. So the moving into our story segment of the show here, we wanted to highlight Brian Perry posted a blog post. He talked about it in episode 284 when we talked about decoupling Drupal. Brian posted on the Bounteous blog an iterative approach to decoupling Drupal. That word is hard to say. But we will have a link to that in the show notes, so you can read up on that. And then if you haven't listened to the episode, you can listen to the episode along with that, and you'll have great context. That it's a longer blog post, so be aware, but it has some great code examples in it, and also kind of some great illustrations on how everything kind of is connected together.
Yeah, it says mini case study. I think it goes more towards a full case study. It's 3,000 words. It's very in depth.
It's mini in the fact that there could be more of them. It's
yeah, I think that's part of it. But it's well written, and it's got a lot of information if you're looking to do something similar.
A detail-rich case study doesn't sound as appealing.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks a lot. So the next thing in stories this week, Dries wrote a blog about this. Section 230 is a part of a law that was passed in 1996 that essentially, there's a lot to it, but essentially it gives safe harbor to certain types of platforms. So what that means is a website, for example, like Reddit is not liable for a site like Reddit is not liable for what people post to the site as long as they take the step to remove unlawful content and report unlawful content properly. If somebody posts a copywritten video or something, they can just remove it and they're not liable. The person posting it is liable, but the platform itself is not liable. And that's, that law really allows a lot of social media companies to exist, because otherwise they would be personally liable anytime when their users posted unlawful content. However, if you've paid attention to the news in the last couple of years, there's also the problem of social media companies allowing disinformation or propaganda or information warfare to be spread on their platform. So there's talk about reforming Section 230, two different sides to it. There's talk about just removing it entirely and making platforms liable for the content that their users post, which would basically end a lot of these platforms, period. Because, a site like Reddit, for example, there's just no way that they could hire enough people to monitor all the content that's there. But on the other end, you do need to combat, misinformation on some level. It gets sticky because what's misinformation? Who defines that? And at least in the US, not around the world, in the US, we do have the concept of free speech. And so, but when does free speech and opinion, when it starts to harm, the community as a whole, when does a company have some sort of responsibility to step in there? And so there's been a lot of talk about Section 230 recently. I think the only thing that's clear is that something needs to change here. I don't think I've seen somebody that has the answer. I certainly don't know the answer.
It's complicated.
And part of the problem is two different people completely agree that it needs to change, but they have completely opposite thoughts on what needs to change. So it's clear that something needs to change. People should, I think, start to inform themselves of it and pay attention, because it will, no matter what the change is, it will have significant impact on
everybody
that operates.
On everybody. So I think the reason we put this in the show notes today, I think, and I've watched this for quite a long time, I think Dries's blog is a decent, if you're not familiar with the topic, is a really good way to sort of get introduced to the issue here. And there is no good answer to this topic, and it's very complicated.
Yeah. I gotta feel though, like holding, I gotta feel that like holding these companies liable, as Nick said earlier, is going to be very much like a death knell to a lot of these companies, like, Reddit or even Twitter. But like, I almost feel like in reform, and I don't know, I haven't read obviously that section of law, but, in the reform, I'm wondering, like, is there some sort of wording or process that we can put in place to require these organizations and these platforms to have, reporting in place and removal or suspension rules that apply to, accounts that are posting such information, right? So
it gets complicated, John, because like, what is misinformation? As Nick mentioned earlier, is, fake news is, what is fake news? Is it, like, how do you define that? It gets complicated.
Sure.
In terms of defining what is true. Like, if I had to post a comment that says, that aliens exist and they're going to attack the earth someday, is that fake news?
Yeah.
It gets really complicated. Take
absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think it's an easy, like, oh, we'll just do this. Like, hey,
yeah,
it's definitely very much A, case by case, and B, what is being said and how it's being used.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing. Like, it's hard to do without being political, but I mean, that you look at even things like vaccination. I mean, it's one thing for people to have questions about vaccines, but a lot of the stuff around vaccinations is just misinformation. It's not accurate, and it causes harm to a lot of people, because when not enough people get vaccinated, you're not hitting herd immunity, right? And other people are not protected. So it's a question of how do you allow people to have a discussion about it so they can be comfortable, for example, with vaccination, without allowing people to just blatantly lie about results.
So Shane, what are your thoughts on Section 230? We've been going round and round here a little bit on the complexities of it, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for me is, I'm definitely a proponent of freedom of sharing information and sharing your opinions, and so that part, makes me really appreciate, Section 230. However, I do see a lot of sharing of misinformation, and, there are some troubling things there too. So I think it's pretty complex, because I don't want to lose that right to be able to, as a, whether it's blog comments on a blog or whatever, having that ability is nice, and not having to worry that you are liable for what your users of your site might post. Mm-hmm. If you take that out, I think a lot of the freedoms to be able to have that are going to go away. But I also, when things do start to get, overly politicized, and you see a lot of fake news getting shared, and you don't know what's true and what's not, it can be sometimes misleading too. So I'm a little torn on some of those things, but overall, I like having that freedom. I just don't know. Maybe there's some revisions that need to be made to make it more.
It's interesting.
I think the last thing that I would say about this, I think the most interesting thing in Dree's art blog post about this is he mentions having something about an FDA for algorithms. So like having some sort of, like, the FDA approve, they're not perfect, but the fact when they approve medication, you generally know that it's safe. There, occasionally something happens, but they're the ones that step in if something, comes up after. They track data for forever. And having something like that for large scale public algorithms, I think is helpful. And I can see that being helpful more than just social media. But like, for example, Facebook 5 or 10 years ago, they did experiments on seeing if they could affect people's emotions by changing their news feed.
Yeah, and like I see. So Nick, that is a different topic, and I don't know why like Dries went to this place, because that to me is a different topic than 230.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
I mean, I
like
could see
the
I could see that.
algorithms is a big issue, right? In terms of promoting content and trying to tailor content to the consumer and selling products. I don't really know how that's related to the 230.
Because I think the relation is just the connection, like the data. Like most of that stuff is user generated content. And so making somebody liable for that means that you're liable for presenting that incorrect data, right? So I think that's how we connected it. I mean, it seemed, now that you call it out, I can see how you would think it would be separate, but when I read it, it seemed connected to me as well. But it's another problem. Same thing, like facial recognition, like all these types of things. Like these are society defining changes in how people will conduct their lives. And there's currently no, like AI, there's no like regulation or information at the government level for that kind of thing. Like, even if you just look at something simple, like non-political, like people always like, yeah, Big Blue could beat anybody in chess. But what was it, 20 years ago?
Yeah.
Chess was a solved game, but Go was going to take another 200 years. It was impossible. And then Google came out and said, hey, we've been working on this AI for Go. And within 6 months, it could be any human player ever. Like, so like you have like these technologies making leaps and bounds beyond what people think are even remotely possible. And that's the stuff that Google is just public about. So like, what are they doing on the back end with their stuff with that kind of information? You have no idea.
I'm even more confused how this applies to Section 230 now.
Yeah.
No, it applies more to large scale algorithms.
Jumping back into Section 230, one thing that Shane touched on, and then we can definitely move on, is comments on a website, right? So like, StephenCross.com, does that have commenting enabled? It does, right?
It does. Yeah.
So now if somebody comes there and posts something that is inflammatory and not true, or whatever, it's just, it's garbage. Stephen's now liable for that, which means now we're looking at the potential for Stephen to get sued by somebody because he didn't post it. And I'm assuming once he knows about it, he will clean it up. But there's a time gap there of somebody knowing about it versus like the getting sued for it. So you kind of could start this culture of like, hey, now everybody's going to be running around trying to sue people for like, people posting things on their platform.
John, this is why the president's recommendation last week of completely repealing 230 doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but reforming it and reviewing it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of issues with it, but just turning it off is insane.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's definitely, it needs reform. Right. And that's what I said originally is like, hey, let's try to work in some rules for organizations to have like processes in place to remove felonious content as opposed to like,
no, they already
going
have
after them.
So that's,
but it's not required. And Twitter and Facebook and all of them have done a pretty poor job of implementing and
you have to remove like threats of bodily harm, that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff still already has to be removed. Like that wouldn't be changing. It's just that.
Of course, if you're going on and saying you're going to hurt somebody, yes. But I guess what I'm referring to more is misinformation, right?
Yeah, misinformation isn't classified at all under this, and that's part of the problem,
right?
But like copywritten information, that kind of stuff, like if Reddit knowingly allows a movie to be posted that's copywritten and they don't have permission and they just let it be there and be downloaded, they would lose safe harbor protection, and they would, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they already have that protection, but it doesn't cover this, bot farm posting misinformation about something type of.
It also comes down to us being better as humans, but that's a topic for a different day.
Moving on. if you have a Drupal camp that you want to promote, we're doing something new now on Talking Drupal. You can send us an audio clip that promotes your camp, and we'll play it on Talking Drupal. So just visit talkingdrupal.com/camp promo, and you can learn some information about that.
Okay, so this is one of the longer intros I think that we've done in a long time. I'm 45 minutes into recording.
It was like an emotional roller coaster.
Yeah.
All right, let's plow through the content.
Yeah. So no, I don't think there's any need to rush. But we've got so this week, as we mentioned, we're basing this on a BOF that Rick Hood did at the Nerd Summit a week or so ago. And it's called All the Ways. It's a pretty cool little presentation that we'll link to. So take a look at that. But he kind of talks through his personal journey for careers, especially in the tech world, and the different technologies that he used over the last 23, 24 years or so. And so I highly recommend it. It's really cool. But we're going to kind of do the same thing with Drupal and talk about all the different ways that Drupal can be used. Because over the last couple of episodes, we've been doing a lot of talk about different decoupled purposes and in a couple of different ways that you can use Drupal. So we thought we'd kind of compile those into a show and talk about maybe some specific examples as well, how people have used Drupal and could use Drupal in the future.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we immediately point to with Drupal is the fact that, I mean, the two selling points for me when I first got into Drupal, and I think, it might be different, but I think everyone kind of come back to these two main points, is that it's open source. That's great, right? If you want to look at how it works, you can take a look at the code, you can change the code, you can do whatever you want with it, right? It's open source. That's a huge benefit. And the community around Drupal, right? Those two things to me are always the biggest selling points about, why I love Drupal, why I think everyone here really likes using Drupal is it's open source and there's a great community of, collaborative people that want to help make Drupal better. And so a lot of people working together, a lot of people improving it over time. But then when you look at the actual individual features that Drupal has that really help set it apart from, some of the other competing, CMSs on the market and other, systems that are similar to Drupal, the structured data that Drupal allows you to do, you can really structure your content. I always, when I got started with Drupal, to me, it was almost like a database management system where you could really structure the content however you wanted, but you didn't need to know SQL to do it, right? You just build out your content types and your fields, and now you have your data model. On top of that,
if you ever have to build one of those yourselves, you will appreciate how much effort that will save you. I mean, there's a lot of frameworks that gives you a lot of flexibility, but most of them, you have to define every last field. Like you want a title field on every page, you have to configure that. You want a text field, a body field, you need to configure that. But yeah, once you build it, once you have to build one of those things yourself or use a framework that doesn't have that out of the box, you'll miss it.
Also, it's also relating data, right? Tagging data, relating data, sorting and organizing data. Like all of that stuff is like out of the box. Like, us being Drupal guys kind of take that for granted.
Yeah. It's building you're building a relational database, right? I mean, that's what you're doing. It's just, you don't have to worry about what's going on underneath the hood. You just know how to interact with it. And it gives you as Nick said, a lot of sensible defaults. So you can do things quickly, but it still gives you the flexibility to really change things if you need to. So that's one of the great things about it. The whole user and permission system. And when I look at Drupal compared to some of the other things out on the market, I really come back to that as a really flexible way to get really granular with how the permissions work, right? Whether it's even to a specific piece of content for specific users, that's possible with, a few extra Drupal modules, right? You just install them and configure it and it works. So just the whole flexibility on the user permission system is really a great selling point for me. And it allows you to build and support very complex use cases and very complex websites. So, I think in the past it was used a lot more for, individual sites, simple blogs. Maybe those days are gone a little bit. I mean, I know people still do it, but it's not as common. But it really,
it's probably not the best use case for Drupal, right?
Exactly.
Anymore.
Yeah. I think people that like Drupal still do it because they
know Drupal.
They want to have it, and they use it as, it's easy for them. But yeah, it isn't the best use case, but the ability for it to scale with, really high demand type websites and build very complex use cases where, you can section off certain pieces of your websites for certain groups of users and those types of things that are very difficult to do. If you were going to build that custom, all the logic that goes into that is, very, just developer intensive. Certainly possible, but by installing a few modules, clicking some buttons, you can get 80% of the way there in a few hours in a lot of cases. And of course that sometimes that 20% is painful, right? Getting it over the last 20%, but Drupal is flexible enough to allow you to do it.
Better than 100% though.
You know what? That last 20% is painful in any technology, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. That's not unique to Drupal.
Right.
But Drupal gets you to that first 80%, in my opinion, a lot faster in a lot of cases.
Very
right?
quick. Yeah.
Yeah. You get that 80%, and a lot of times that's good enough for proof of concept. So you can show something really quick. And then of course, you spend the time to finish the last bit. And it just changes over time, right? It's a community, so it's always changing. It's always improving. Like the jumps that I've seen from, Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, and then Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, and then, now kind of the constantly improvements into Drupal 9 are just pretty impressive. And it's not always, I don't know that we agree with every single decision that's ever been made, but in general, I think the direction that we're going is a direction that allows you to build these really complex, scalable websites that, of course you can do with other technologies, but using Drupal is a really valid way to do it. And it's a pretty good experience.
Yeah. I don't think you would say that Drupal has been ahead of the curve in technology. Right. But I do think it's fair to say, they are in line or slightly behind. So they let other tools like prove the technology, and then they're following up behind it.
I would actually just disagree with that.
Okay.
On some level, I think what happens is they leapfrog. So when they redo something big, they generally get to the tip of the curve. They push it, but then they stay there while the rest of the world moves on. It's like, for example, the testing infrastructure for Drupal, that or like the Git process for Drupal.org, like that stuff was ahead of its time. But over time, better technologies came out, and it took a very long time to update to those. I'm convinced that the GitLab stuff that we're doing, that the Drupal Association is doing for Drupal.org, is pushing the envelope in a lot of places. Will that be there now 15 years from now, and it's going to be another massive migration to the new technology? Who knows? But Drupal tends to, I think, find something, push the envelope, then stay there for a very, very long time.
I think I'm somewhere in the middle of you, of Stephen and Nick here, right? Because I feel like we're actually seeing this currently with the release of Drupal 9. I think Drupal used to be like, hey, it's this PHP CMS, right? And through the years, and it's been years, they've adopted jQuery, and they've adopted different kind of more mainstream technologies, Symfony, more recently. And I think we're going to start seeing that that cycle or that loop speeding up, and I think we're going to start seeing Drupal maybe not being a leader, but very much being pretty close behind some of these technologies as they come out. I think the initiatives that we have in place with around JS frameworks and stuff like that. I think those are going to be where we're going to start to see kind of a ramp up in Drupal's evolution and scalability, and bringing in these other projects to kind of support some of the already great data structuring tools that Drupal already has.
Hey, don't you think that while I think us developers are anxious to move to new technologies, but Drupal as a whole has been very good about moving customers through the technology change at a slow, steady pace that's reasonable to consume and pay for, and take them through that journey? As opposed to us developers, I think we're more anxious to move to the latest thing, but like customers just need the functionality. And I feel like Drupal has taken them through that journey at a pace that's reasonable for them to consume.
I think with the 7 to 8 to 9 upgrade, that has definitely been the case.
Right.
And I agree with you. I think if Nick had mentioned earlier the Drupal.org Git migration, right? I think the reason that wasn't at the forefront, or that it has taken so long, is, as Stephen said, I think developers are a little bit hard to move on some of these things sometimes. So, I think some of the underpinnings can take a little longer because you have to move the development community. But the forward-facing product side of things, Drupal 7, Drupal 8, Drupal 9 can move a little bit quicker, or at a comfortable pace, I guess I should say, because it's, to your point, Stephen, the client's like, well, I need this feature. I need it to do this thing, right? And if 9 does that, I'm going to use 9. If 8 does that, I'm going to use 8. So on and so forth. So I think, I think it's complex, but overall, Drupal's biggest strength is that it's evolving, it's scalable. And, I think we'd all agree on that.
So Drupal has shined in a few vertical markets. Education, government, and nonprofit stick out to me as 3 pillars of where they've excelled greatly. And there could be a few others. I'm interested if you guys have some others in there. But education, let's look at that first. I've worked on probably 3 higher education websites over my Drupal career. Mm-hmm. I expect you guys all have as well, right? Mm-hmm. Is that true?
Yeah. Yes. Yep. That's immediately when we're talking about verticals, education comes to mind.
Why do you guys think that is? Why is that?
I think it's more, I think business goes, smaller businesses will go to what's maybe a little bit more approachable and easier. So a lot of times they lean towards WordPress, but education leans more towards what's the better way to manage larger amounts of content, right? Education typically has thousands and thousands of pages. They have different departments and more complex needs. And I think that's why you see Drupal being such a, more dominating force in the education space, especially with, colleges where you have those more complex needs.
Yeah.
Overall.
So an education site is a .edu, and then there's a ton of microsites or smaller sites underneath that .edu domain that requires certain permissions and structures and that kind of stuff.
There are a lot of EDUs out there that have built whole platforms for that structure, right? They have different components and different functionality that allows you to spin up one site and then spin up a bunch of microsites underneath it. I also think another point there for education is, maybe a cost factor, right? Drupal is
open source.
It is there are no licensing fees. I'm not going to say it's free, but there are no licensing fees, right? They can pay for talent. They can bring in employees and have them work on this platform, their platform, their site, and get a lot, as Shane said, get a lot out of the box without a lot of development.
And I think it's PHP too. It's PHP is a really accessible language. It's really easy for beginner developers to get into. So it's really easy for people managing the sites to kind of just dig in and make customizations that they need. But I think you guys hit the nail on the head. It's really like the data structure and the permissioning, I think, are the two big things that, and install profiles and those kinds of things really made it a star for education.
Yeah.
So I imagine like the second one I listed was government. Everything we just said applies to government, like as it did for education, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I
I would add one more, is just general, the security of it too. Overall, it's been, very secure.
Yeah.
Not saying there's not been some issues, of course.
Hardcore knocking on wood right now, Shane.
Yeah. But, and of course there always will be, but the security team and all, major versions of modules get reviewed. And so, I've worked with, education. I haven't worked with a lot of government, but some larger colleges will only use, certain versions of modules if they meet certain criteria and they have security coverage. And so those things kind of add that extra stamp of, comfort, I guess, for, whether it's education institutions or government agencies.
Yeah. And I think, that's where I was going to go too, because the thing is, Drupal is somewhat unique in that there's a security council, like a group of security people looking at it. There's several hosting platforms that have dedicated security people that look at it and work on issues. If you're working on a smaller CMS, it might be open source, but they might have one person that's the security guy, and who knows if he actually is good at security or not. You're getting really inconsistent security releases, if any. There's no security newsletter to get updated when a security release comes out for those other CMSs that I've used. So I think that's a huge benefit. You can know that and there's a huge install base. So if there's an issue, it'll likely, a real issue, it'll likely get found sooner than later before, the majority of stuff, gets compromised. Even the really bad, Drupal-geddon that happened 7-8 years ago, that was discovered by a team auditing Drupal for their own site, and it was released. And yes, a lot of sites were hacked, but if you were on that security newsletter, you could have updated it in time.
That event that shall not be named.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that is important here is distributions, right? So a lot of our educational clients, a lot of our state and local government type clients are using Drupal in a distribution format, as Stephen talked about at the when he first brought this up. Being able to say like, hey, here's our template for a site. We're going to spin this out to a bunch of different microsites is super, super duper valuable. One other vertical that comes to mind is e-commerce, right? So like Drupal commerce is probably a pretty big vertical out there, and the ability to kind of build a very wide scale of e-commerce solution, right? So like a very basic store where you're like selling one product, or a very complex store where you need to integrate with other systems and you need to have fulfillment, you need to do everything. Like, Drupal commerce has been around for a while. So I think that's definitely a vertical worth mentioning.
Yeah. I mean, I would just say that I think with Drupal 8, just like with Drupal 8 itself, I think Drupal 8 commerce doesn't handle that simple solution very well, just like Drupal doesn't handle the simple blog as well anymore. I mean, Drupal commerce is bear to set up, and there's just it's not like with commerce in Drupal 7 or even UberCart in Drupal 6, if you wanted to set up a single product thing that you'd ship out, it was an hour or two to configure. With Drupal commerce, you're creating 35 entities that seem to overlap for no reason. and it takes a lot of effort to configure properly.
Yeah, I mean, I think Commerce 2X makes it streamlines the process a little bit, but there is still configuration, and we don't need to debate it. But I think
this
it's
is not to become a commerce show.
I think it's a useful vertical for Drupal, and just another way that it's flexible. So moving on into a world that I've been part of for quite a while is the agency world, and there's a lot to consider with Drupal, and why an agency uses Drupal as opposed to something else. I think overall, the show's going to be a lot about Drupal scalability and flexibility, because that's the big reason for agencies to use Drupal. I think it provides a lot out of the box that doesn't have to be, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? So at a very basic level, you have a permissioning and user login system right there. Don't have to build it. You have a content, structured content system. Don't have to build it. And I think the fact that it's flexible, you can, as Shane said, download a module that will get you 80% of the way to what you may need, or 100% if it's a really, really useful module. And it allows for a much quicker product to be developed from like the start to actual finished product. And I think I think that's why a lot of agencies use Drupal.
I think onboarding too for agencies would be super valuable, because there's Drupal developers, because you can get a lot of those features with the homegrown CMS too. That's mature enough, but you don't get anytime you hire somebody.
You don't get the community with a homegrown CMS.
Exactly. You don't get the community with it, and you don't have anybody that gets onboarded has to learn this new system, and that new system isn't necessarily going to provide value for the future for those developers. Whereas Drupal, Drupal is a very broadly used CMS. So if you're hiring developers, you're likely going to be able to find a Drupal developer.
It's also comforting to clients too. When you say, hey, we're going to build your site using Drupal, a lot of times, and this is probably more of a past practice than a present practice, but a lot of companies would build your site in their, quasi proprietary CMS, and you were stuck with it. You had to work with that company forever, because they basically owned the code for your website, right? With Drupal now, we can say, hey, we're going to do an open source Drupal website, and hopefully you work with us forever. But if something happens, and this relationship doesn't work out, there are a million other agencies and shops and people that you could work with your project. So I think that's definitely super appealing, both to the agency and the client.
Hey, John, working for Oomph, and we've seen Oomph go from a WordPress company to WordPress and Drupal, then to I think primary Drupal company, less WordPress, and now moving into some headless Gatsby stuff. Mm-hmm. From you in a sales position at Oomph, mm-hmm. What is your criteria for the perfect Drupal customer?
Yeah, so
versus some of those other technologies which are still valid, WordPress is valid. I don't know if you guys still do that, and Gatsby is valid. Where is the sweet spot for you?
Yeah. So I think ultimately we're moving to, Drupal is what we know. Drupal is where we have our talent, but ultimately we're becoming more and more technology agnostic. And don't worry, I'll get back to your question in a second, but we're becoming definitely more focused on building platforms that solve the pain points that a lot of our clients have, and whether that's using Gatsby on the front end, Drupal on the back end, or integrating with a bunch of third-party services. I think ultimately where Drupal fits in that kind of platform architecture is again, what we said at the beginning of the show, structured data, being able to have a easy to use interface for an admin to easily input data and then use that data in maybe one front end, 6 front ends, 25 front ends, or connecting those kind of disparate systems, because that's really where I think Drupal shines, is great structured data. If you put some effort into the admin, it can be easy for admins to use, which can be a pain point for a lot of folks, but also the ability to connect disparate systems, right? So you imagine using Gatsby on the front end of your site and having all of that data kind of flowing into Drupal from your CRM system, your donation management system, your e-commerce storefront fulfillment system. So, I often refer to Drupal as kind of the glue that holds those kind of systems together in a platform architecture. So, I think to get back to your question, it's really finding what the right technology is, and a lot of times what's under the hood is probably going to get us to Drupal. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes Drupal is just overkill for a project, and that's kind of where we put our thinking hats on and say, like, we could do this. We could do this with just Gatsby. We could use Redux and some other services and get this done. But I think a lot of times we come back to Drupal for its flexibility. We come back to it for its structured content. We come back to it for its ease of use.
So speaking of that, what are the different types of websites that can be built in Drupal? Because this is something that we've talked about a couple of times the last few weeks, or I guess you could say this is what we've been talking about on Talking Drupal for the last 8 years. But Drupal nowadays really shines when the website does something, quote unquote, isn't just a landing page or a blog page. It has some sort of business logic or use case, whether that's, I have a client that, they have press releases, they'll do an acquisition, and part of the contract for the acquisition is the press release has to go out at this minute. And so they've got some logic set up to allow that publishing workflow and to dump a lot of caches when that happens. You've got, John mentioned, CRMs, I've got clients that they'll integrate with the CRM, but Drupal will receive some sort of action from a user and then communicate that back to the CRM, gather some additional information, and then generate a report for somebody. Another thing that's pretty common is using something like Webform. I know that, a lot of companies use Webform to do a lot of different survey type things, and building a report system for that is pretty helpful. If you have a really complex data model, and we've been kind of hammering on this point, all show, but Drupal excels at interrelated complex data models. That's really what it excels at. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, to go back to, integrating with other systems, just as an example, in Drupal, it's easy to do. And a lot of you probably have examples like this, but one task I had to do one time was integrate with, I think it was GoToWebinar, right? And GoToWebinar has an API, and you can just on cron go out to the API, pull in any new webinars and drop it into a content type and display that data on a Drupal website. That workflow is pretty common, and that ability to make it really easy to write a little simple module, or even use some contributed modules, that you can actually do some of that stuff too. It makes it really easy to integrate in with other systems, and then you pull in the content structured how you want, and you can do whatever you want with it. And it goes both ways, whether it's another system hitting a webhook on your Drupal site, you can configure that pretty easy, or you want to reach out to an API and pull data in. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and Drupal's flexibility really shines there when you're saying, I want to pull content into Drupal, or pull structured data from other places, structure it the way I want, and then use it for something else.
Yeah, and Drupal, when you look at it that way, Drupal really does a good job too of being like an intermediary API. So one of the first really complex APIs that I worked on with Drupal, it was Drupal 7. Actually, it was for a company that was a large company that had a bunch of different teams working on a bunch of different projects. And they wanted to create a couple of customer dashboards, but they were just having a lot of trouble because everything had to integrate with different APIs, multiple APIs. And so what Drupal was just a two-way API. So Drupal exposed an API to the teams generating the dashboards in the front end. And on the back end, I just integrated with, I think it was like 6 or 7 other internal APIs. So like when they needed to get a customer's data, they no longer had to talk to Oracle and DynamoDB and this and this and this just to get all the different pieces of content. They would just call the customer API that I generated, and that would have all that data stored, or if some of the stuff had to be on call, it would grab that data, collate it, put it together, and send it back to them in a unified manner. And Drupal really excels for that because, you know, some things you can cache things that you need to. You have cron. You know, people I think really take cron for granted in Drupal. A lot of sites, getting a task runner that's consistent is a massive problem. And just the ability to say, hey, run cron every 5 minutes. And then you can set up a hook cron or whatever you want to set up in Drupal 8 and like have a way, like have things run when they need to run. That's a complex problem in a lot of technologies.
I think it's super interesting because the way I always answer this question when it's like types of websites, I always go like every website, right? Like you could feel, you know, for what all intents and purposes, build any type of website with Drupal. One example I think is interesting here. And I don't know that we talked too much about nonprofits in the verticals conversation, but one use case for Drupal that I absolutely love in the types of websites, you know, nonprofits usually, for the most part, are trying to watch their bottom line. And, you know, obviously, again, Drupal has no licensing fees. But with Drupal and the web forms module and the Stripe connection or the Stripe module, you could actually build a pretty robust donation form. Yep. And then use Drupal as your donation management system. So now you've cut out the cost of having to pay for, you know, a licensing fee for a website, having to pay for a licensing fee for your donor management system, having to, I mean, there is going to be some overhead from Stripe on the transaction, but you know, you're cutting out any donor service that you might be using and them charging you a fee. So it's a great way to minimize costs in that example. So a lot of things to think about there, I think.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things too is Drupal's always had, you know, for any popular service, almost there's usually a module that integrates with. So even if it's not going to fit your use case, you can use examples that are like Stripe. There's a Drupal Stripe module. There's a Drupal MailChimp module. You know, there's tons of, most common services will have a module. And like I said, even if you need to extend that or you need to just write it yourself, you'll have some sort of example to work from. And Drupal really shines with that interconnection of data and APIs.
Yeah, and then talking about APIs, Drupal really fits in, and there's been a big push to make Drupal the headless CMS of choice, right? Where you're now using Drupal as an API for something else, whether, you know, the common case, you know, is maybe a Gatsby website or using some kind of static site generator. Maybe it's Next.js or Vue.js, and you're just turning on JSON API or the Drupal GraphQL module or some way to expose all that structured content that you can organize in Drupal, expose it over an API, and then use that content somewhere else.
Wait a second. Are you telling me there are other static site generators out there? Gatsby isn't the only one.
I mean, it's the best one, but I'm a little biased.
Nice. Perfect.
But yes, there are others. There are others you can use. And, you know, one example that I've done in the past is, this has been a few years, but I built a mobile app using Ionic. So then it was cross-platform on Android or iOS. And there's also a Drupal website component for the app, but you could expose the data through an API. So you did all the user authentication was through Drupal, all the content and the data. You could update the Drupal site and it would feed into the app. Or this app actually had the ability to, users could upload pictures. And in that case, some of that data was stored in a Firebase and kind of referenced to Drupal, but still it could have easily been done in Drupal too. So there's all that kind of interconnected data between these disparate systems, and it's all powered by Drupal, but you have, an app on the App Store that uses that data generated by Drupal.
I did that too, and I completely forgot to mention that. But yeah, it's actually, the useful thing is it means that any content updates. I remember one of the requirements aside from the app data was like the end user license, things like that. Like it means you don't have to do a new release to deploy something new that's content based, because a lot of times that's a blocker. Like if you need to update the terms of service, or you need to update a header or something. Well, now you need to do another release. And for Android, doing a release is usually pretty straightforward once you've gone through a couple of releases. But iOS, sometimes you can get held up for a week or two just because. And so if you need to update something like that, having it pull from an API just means you go to the Drupal site and change it. You don't have to.
I will say, I feel like the show, the title of the show was a little boastful, because I do not feel we're coming to the end of the show, and I don't know that we've gone through all the ways. I mean, I don't even know if we talked for full 24 hours, if we could go through all the ways, but I think we did a pretty good job of covering most of them.
Have questions or feedback? Reach out to us on Twitter at Talking Drupal, the Talking Drupal channel on Drupal Slack, or email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can get show updates by signing up for a newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
As you heard Stephen mention before, you can promote your Drupal camp right here on Talking Drupal. To learn more, you can go to talkingdrupal.com/camp promo. That's camp promo, all one word.
And thanks to our patrons for supporting Talking Drupal. I want to call out our administrator patrons, Aaron, Mark, Mike, and Saul. Their support over the last year has been fantastic to pay for the expenses to host this show. So you can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose the Become a Patron button.
And if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you this week, Stephen, how could they do that?
StephenCross.com.
And if our listeners want to get in touch with you, John, this week?
You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, as well as Drupal.org. And you can find out about Inc. at oomphinc.com.
And how about you, Shane? You're muted.
Muted.
Is this my first time?
It is. It is.
SM Thomas 3 on Twitter, or LinkedIn would be great too.
That's your mulligan.
And listeners can get in touch with me at Nixvan, NICXVAN, pretty much everywhere. And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Bye.
Have a good one.